Hello, I'm Caroline Jones, candidate number 0014820006, and I've been studying standard level art, and I'd like to show you my exhibition. I'd like to start with my pencil study of a skeleton, and I chose to start off with this as it was quite a nice way of looking at an analytical and detailed piece, and really focusing on detail and structure and shape. Throughout my entire studies, I've been trying to work on this sort of style of a relatively loose style whilst retaining overall precision. So if you look carefully at some of the detail, I've used quite energetic pencil lines, but overall it still has a strong sense of precision. I decided to use the skeleton initially because it's been a recurring motif in the entire history of art, because it's always been prevalent. It's often been used as a motif for mortality, for death, but I also furthermore thought it could be an image of simplicity and just lack of any masks or decoration. So I just wanted to have this nice, pure, analytical study of the skeleton to begin my work. So after studying this, I moved on to this piece, in which I focus more on the skull, but also painting it, so I can include colour as well. So you can see I tried to use an expressionist style of painting, including yellows, pinks, blues, where previously I just had this sort of grayscale pencil study. And in order to add a more dramatic element to the piece, I also dripped some oils upside down on the piece to create some movement in the skull. Then after doing this, I initially just left it blank, but later I came back to it after studying artists such as Ewan Uglow, who uses sort of broad shapes in his image in order to create a sense of composition. So I was asked to participate in this BBC documentary studying Rembrandt's portraiture with the photographer Rankin. And one thing that really struck me about studying Rembrandt was his use of rubbed acrylic backgrounds, in which a lot of different colours are used and blended together and just rubbed into the piece in order to create an interesting texture to the background. So for example here, it looks sort of primarily a sort of greenish colour, but into the green I've blended ochres, blues, reds, and it all creates this nice interesting texture to the piece. Well, after the skull I wanted to look at the human form, so I attended a few life drawing sessions and I've got some work from that. So I started off with this one because I wanted to try and focus on a more challenging piece using foreshortening and perspective in order to really hone in on my ability to analyse shape, because naturally it's very easy to misinterpret shapes when your brain leads you to want to draw the foot sort of the same size as you would imagine it in real life. So this is almost an exercise in drawing what you see and not what you think you ought to see. But furthermore, I really like the composition of this piece. Both this and this drawing mimics sort of Rococo poses because they sort of use soft, undulating figures. There's a lot in this, in the body that leads the eyes across the piece in this sort of triangular formation. So, for example, the arms, the breasts, the pubic bone, even the belly button all sort of lead the eyes across. So I thought that was particularly nice composition. So this was also a vaguely Rococo pose where I really tried to focus on the back because I used a lot of different links in my sketchbook to artists looking at the back. And I found it really interesting because it's so often seen as just sort of a blank canvas, whereas actually I think there can be a lot of attention to detail in the muscles, the waistline, sort of the arch of the middle of the back. So these are far more Renaissance type poses because they sort of show action and more dynamic movements. And here I was using just two chalk pastels, brown and sort of orangey yellow, in order to mimic the way her body catches the light. Without using too much detail or shading as I did with these ones, I wanted to sort of focus on trying to be able to capture the female form in just a few expressive lines, and confident lines as well. So for example here I just sort of used one line in order to allow myself to capture the hip. Yeah, I did that one I think in 6 minutes, and these two I did in 2 minutes and 4 minutes respectively. And similarly for these I was using just a few essential lines in order to try and capture the shape of the figure. So for example the legs you can see has all been done in one single movement, and this all sort of works with the sort of trying to fit it into a limited timescale. But in particular here I quite liked the fact that it almost looked as if it was capturing her movement, the two in succession. So perhaps this is sort of her moments ago and this is her presently, it's sort of movement around. Yeah, I quite liked the idea of capturing evanescent moments because I studied in my sketchbook artists such as Degas or the Ukiyo-e movement in Japan. which focuses on capturing females in fleeting positions. So having looked at these reclining poses and posture positions, I then moved on to choose a more sedentary position. So here I wanted to experiment with different screen prints onto a series of collages. And I've used different pieces of newspaper, some tracing paper, just different warm colours of paper in order to sort of create a sense of composition. So for example here I've used soft tears of the paper in order to echo the shape of the sofa and sort of where her arm sits. And that contrasts quite nicely with the sort of cut of this piece of the Financial Times here. And I quite like how the square echoes the overall square of the piece. However, having used these sort of harshly cut lines here, I decided that actually I want to stick with the sort of soft tears. So in here I've just used sort of the tear in order to sit where the sofa would, to create a sense of composition. And here similarly, predominantly within the piece there are only sort of soft tears that are created, but the actual contours of the magazine here almost frame the piece instead. And in each one they're sort of made different by the fact that I've printed them in slightly different ways. So in this one I've just used a plain black screen print, whereas here I offset it by printing first in a sort of whitish grey, and then over the top slightly offset in black in order to sort of create a sort of sense of being 3D and more dramatic. And it sort of makes her stand out slightly more against the background. And here, because of the darker shape, the darker colour of the magazine here contrasts with the slightly lighter colours, I decided to use a sort of blend of white into black over the piece, and this sort of that uses this marbled effect and works quite nicely so that she always stands out against the background. So here, after looking at Degas in particular, who focused on sort of capturing women in these poses, which almost aren't really posed because it's just capturing them in the everyday activities such as washing, or in this case, sort of tying her hair up. So I looked further at artists such as Lautrec, Renoir, and Ingres, who all studied the sort of similar compositions of having the back as the main focus of the painting. And I particularly liked painting this because it allowed me to sort of use all these different colours and sort of subtle shades in order to create the shape and the movement of the back. And finally, what I really liked about this painting is that it allowed me to use mathematics and art, which I focused a lot in my sketchbook, and I take high-level maths, so I enjoyed looking at that. So the entire piece has this sort of sense of a Fibonacci spiral, because the eyes enter, I think, through her foot, around the arms, and even the movement of her hair has this idea of a Fibonacci spiral. And similarly, I use the rule of thirds very, very loosely in order to create the composition of the background. And I thought this shape here in particular, the darker sort of tones, was immensely important to the structure of my painting because it prevents the eye from being shot off the edge when it follows the arms around, because without it, I felt that the composition or the line of sight was around and then back off the painting again. So this sort of block just allows the eyes to be caught and sent back round into sort of the shape of the hair. So after this one, I want to do another nude, a slightly more contemplative pose and using a slightly different palette of colour since it's predominantly greens here. And in the next one that I'm about to show you, I've used sort of slightly more natural pinks, ochres and purples instead. So here I've used a slightly warmer palette, mimicking artists such as Jenny Saville and Freud, with sort of more pink shades and yellows and purples, while still sort of retaining sort of slight indications of green there in order to sort of give a sense of shadow. This was influenced by Alice Neal, who would sort of use just a very minimalist and subtle shape in the background in order to create a sense of environment, just to make sure the space seemed relevant and evoke a sense of place, I guess. But I also was inspired by artists such as Alex Kanofsky, whose art merges into the background slightly because they use similar palettes, and so similarly here, I've used a sort of flesh-coloured background so that she just sort of slightly merges into it and she doesn't stand out too abruptly. And in the background, I didn't want it to be entirely flat, so I've just sort of used slight indications of cooler colours, which also bring out some slight shades in her body, but also the shadow I think works quite well because since I lit her from above, she almost sort of sits in a pool of her shadow, and the cooler colours bring out all of the other greens, just the slight indications in the background.
So finally we come to your two big compositions that we've got.
So here I started focusing more on the idea of fears and psychological expressions in my paintings. This is all based on the fear of open spaces, agoraphobia, which is the title of the painting. She's comparatively small compared to the background, and she's kind of dominated by this host of different prints and patterns over the top and all around her, in order to sort of create the sense that she's overwhelmed and almost frightened. So in the background, similarly, like in my nude over here, the sense, the spiral shape, I've tried to evoke that as well here. So I've got spirals here and up across the top of the piece, and all of these overlaid prints sort of make it quite intricately patterned and overwhelming. So I've got some squares printed, screen printed here. I've got opaque white and sort of faces, which is almost sort of anonymous faces, making it quite ominous. And I was inspired broadly by artists such as Robin Rauschberg, who used lots of different screen prints over the top of each other in order to make a very intricate and patterned design. So I tried to sort of mimic his idea, and also kirigami artists and the use of different cutouts over one another, which I thought, when I first saw it, it was quite sort of startling, all of these bright colours over one another, and so I decided to try and reflect that in my own art. So looking more at the figure, I tried to use this idea of geometry again, so there's sort of the triangle formation of her arms and also her legs to some extent. And since the arm sort of goes up and holds her head, I thought that sort of evoked a sense of headache and nausea, and so I tried to mimic that using op art with sort of triangular design, similarly creating the sense of nausea and how overwhelmed she is by all these emotions and feeling of trauma, I guess. So continuing the sense of phobias, I then looked at this, which is trying to create a sense of claustrophobia instead. And in contrast with that image, she's very large, the figure, compared to the size of the canvas, and almost that she's trying to sort of break out of the canvas because of these dynamic lines here of the arms, and again sort of a triangle formation, which I previously saw in my life drawing. Sort of creates an arrow out of the piece as if she's about to try and break out. And also similarly, I used lots of screen prints in order to express this trauma that she's feeling and the psychological stress that I'm trying to evoke. With particular build-up at the top of the painting, I've used lots and lots of screen prints over one another in order to create a sense of gravity and weight sort of pushing her down. And so as you can see at the bottom, I've used very few screen prints, only sort of loose dribbles of paint and this sort of square design in order to give her still a sense of being grounded in the painting. So for these two paintings in particular, I really enjoyed using the same figure in different poses and different canvases and different sizes in order to create completely different emotions in the painting. And particularly the pose here looks as if she's about to start moving, whereas in here it almost looks as if she's in the end of her movement trying to curl it and protect herself. So finally, this was a dress that I designed for our school fancy fashion competition, in which everyone designs and creates their own dress, and this year the theme was tradition and innovation. So I wanted to use both these ideas. So for the skirt, I've stuck in pieces of newspaper, and the bottom is made up predominantly of 19th century book covers. And this transitions almost into the innovation, so this juxtaposition of the traditional papers and books and modern technology, because I've just printed strips of binary code and wrapped it around the bodice of the dress. And when it was actually being modelled, we also had a red sash here, so that these sheets of paper almost exploded out of this red sash and represented this transition between the two. And the entire outfit, I think, was drawn together because we also added some red lipstick to the model, which sort of just nicely matched the sash and brought the entire outfit together, so I think it worked very well.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for showing us your exhibition.
Thank you very much.